Dracula must think he was an idiot. I mean, the Count had to, or else Jonathan wouldn't still be alive. Jonathan sat at dinner that night, and he smiled. The Count was rambling on and on, apologizing for being away so long. He had countless preparations to make before moving across the continent, but he could see Jonathan was happy and healthy. Jonathan was neither. He was doing all he could to keep it together, keep smiling, keep playing the idiot the Count believed him to be. But the truth was that he couldn't wipe the image of the Count's fury from his mind, and the sounds of that child. "Mr. Harker," the Count broke in. He was looking straight at Jonathan. "Right, yes, sorry." Jonathan shook his head. He had just zoned out a bit. The Count cleared his throat. He would be making one last trip into town the next day, before getting all of his affairs in order at the castle. Unfortunately, mail service that far out in the woods was spotty, and the Count didn't know if they would be able to send letters before they headed out. The man leaving the post office tomorrow was a reliable one. His letters always went through, so if Jonathan wanted to write some letters and post-date them, the carrier would send them out at the appropriate dates after he made it to the city. Just a little something to keep everyone at home appraised on Jonathan's status, his whereabouts, etc. 3 letters should do it. 1 letter today, letting them know of the plans. 1 letter dated about 2 weeks from today, saying he was leaving Castle Dracula. And 1 letter dated June 29th, the day he would board a ship for home. Jonathan smiled and didn't hesitate. Of course, that was a brilliant idea. That way no one would worry. Or look for him. The Count grinned, his white teeth glistening in the candlelight. He laid out 3 crisp envelopes. Jonathan took up his pen and scratched out the 3 dates, pausing a long time on the 3rd one. June 29th. Jonathan tried to smile, but he couldn't. June 29th would be the last day anyone heard from him. June 29th would be the day he died. I'm Jason Weiser. From Bardic, this is Fictional. It was early August. Mina strolled down the beach. She stopped by the graveyard. Again, every day she took a walk, and every day she found herself here, staring absent-mindedly at the rows and rows of headstones. She'd snap out of it after a few minutes, and then she'd wonder why she kept doing this. Why did she continually end up here? On some level, she knew. It was Jonathan. He should have been back by then. It had been over 2 months since he had traveled east to talk to some count. It was his last job as an assistant. He had just passed his exams to become a full-fledged solicitor himself. She had been learning how to type. She already knew shorthand. She didn't know if he would want her help, but if he did, she was ready. Any day now, they were going to start building a life together. Except now, he was missing. Mina shook the thought from her mind. Not missing, he wasn't missing. He was late. Yeah, that was all. There was a lot between England and Romania. There were many places he could be delayed. A carriage could have broken down. He could have missed his ride. His ship could have gone down. She turned to the graveyard. When she and Lucy were walking by last week, they stopped and talked with Mr. Swales. He was a kind old man, and he walked with them, congratulating Lucy on her engagement to Arthur Holmwood. As they walked, he pointed out different things about the graves. Apparently most of the plots in the graveyard were empty. They were for those that had been lost at sea. Lost at sea. Mina bit her bottom lip and shook her head again. No, she wouldn't let that thought take hold. The comment did, however, remind her of the ship, the Demeter. She and Mr. Swales had been sitting on the coast, watching the Demeter drifting lazily. Mr. Swales laughed and said that they'd hear more about that ship, mark his words. And they did. The article ran a couple of days later. The Demeter had washed ashore overnight. The entire crew had disappeared, and the captain? Mina shuddered. But, try as she might, her mind kept turning to the vast and open sea. The captain was found dead. The article said he had lashed himself to the wheel of his ship. There must have been a horrendous storm, leading the man to lose his entire crew and pray for his life. he was found still gripping his rosary, the crucifix still tapping gently on the wheel of the ship in the calm winds of the morning. It was said that the night before, as soon as the Demeter scraped ashore on the rocks, a big black dog bounded off the boat and disappeared into the shadows. Mina didn't read the rest of the article. The thought of the death at sea, mixed with the fact that her Jonathan was a week delayed, was too much. If she had kept reading, she would have learned that the ship had come from the east, from the same area Jonathan had gone on his business trip. It was cargo, a number of large wooden boxes. They were delivered to the Carfax estate, down by London. Rumor had it some rich nobleman from far away had just bought it. What was the harm in giving a man a bit of sugar? Dr. John Seward shuddered. They'd gotten there too late. Nothing was left of the sparrow, except for half a bloody wing and a talon. Renfield smiled, and Dr. Seward looked away. The man still had blood and feathers in his teeth. He chewed, bones snapping like twigs beneath his teeth. It was life, he told Dr. Seward. Strong life. And it gave life to him. It had started out as a bit of sugar on the windowsill. Dr. Seward didn't see any harm in that. Then the flies started to come. More and more came, and Dr. Seward became annoyed. He said that it was a mental asylum, not a dump. The flies had to go. With a smile, Renfield agreed. Of course they would. A week later, the room became full of spiders. This, being absolutely worse than flies, was quickly forbidden, and soon sparrows started showing up. The last of which Renfield just consumed. Life gave him life, the man repeated. Seward was just happy that the hospital policy forbade the kitten Renfield had wanted. A shot of opium in the neck calmed the man down enough for them to clean up the room. While he was out, Dr. Seward took a look at Renfield's booklet. They had given him a booklet, one of theirs actually. Seward tried to accommodate his patients, within reason, and as long as they didn't want to eat kitties. Oftentimes their writing and art were as confused and delirious as their speech. Not Renfield's, though. Renfield's work was orderly, rigorous. It was like looking at a professor's notebook. He took detailed notes on the animals he had captured. If it wasn't for one phrase, that there was power in the blood, it would have looked like any other scientist's notebook. The doctor closed the notebook and tucked it back under Renfield's pillow. There was something new here. Something different. The man was insane, absolutely, but there was a certain consistency to it. Dr. Seward would stay late tonight, scouring journals. If he was lucky, Mr. Renfield was the first of his kind. He would call Renfield the Zoophagus patient, the life eater. Mina sat up in her bedroom. Lucy was sleepwalking. Again. When the summer started, Mina was newly engaged to a solicitor, and Lucy was alone. Now 3 proposals and 2 broken hearts later, Lucy was engaged, and Jonathan still had not returned. His last letter had come nearly 40 days ago, saying he was on the boat. It was in his own handwriting, she knew, but it didn't sound like him. Of course, Mina was happy for Lucy. She loved Lucy. It was just that their lives had changed so much. Lucy had turned down Dr. Seward and Quincy Morris, a rich Texan from America, to marry a future lord. Prospects didn't get any better than that. Now, there was the sleepwalking. It started a couple days ago. Mina remembered because it was the same night she and Swale saw the Demeter drifting. Something rattled. Lucy was trying the lock again. After Lucy started sleepwalking, Mina talked to her mother, Mrs. Westernrow. Lucy's father had the same problem. The man would even get dressed and leave the house if they let him. That's why they started locking the front door. They didn't want Lucy to walk herself into the sea or fall off a cliff in the night. Still, Mina had to listen to her night after night. Walking, trying the door, trying the window. Mina tried talking to Lucy. Without fail, she remembered nothing the next day, adamant that she wasn't sleepwalking at all. On the bright side, Lucy did seem to be feeling better. For a while, she was lethargic, anemic even. Now, the glow in her eyes had returned. Mina looked back to the paper on her writing desk. The town of Whitby was agog with excitement over the ship that had run ashore, and they had published the captain's log in full. It read like a ghost story. 10 days out from Russia, a crewman disappeared. That same night, they saw a tall, thin man aboard. Soon, more and more of the crewmen disappeared, until one night, just off the English coast, a fog consumed the ship. When it emerged, the captain was dead, the only one left aboard, lashed to the wheel with his crucifix. His funeral was the next day. Lucy finally settled down upstairs, just as the lightning cracked outside. Mina wasn't scared of thunder. She was, however, scared for Jonathan, and prayed that wherever he was safe. Far to the east, a man collapsed trying to cross the border. He looked back in terror, screaming something in a language they didn't understand. His blood and sweat-caked suit was practically in ribbons. One of his feet was missing a shoe, lost in mud or worse, and now it was covered in cuts and bruises. Tears streamed as the man screamed, looking back at the forest, trying to push his way through the crossing. The border guards pushed him back, and he gave up. And then some. The man, exhausted after running for days through the forest, collapsed. It was a few days later, in a hospital in Budapest, that the man finally awoke. He whispered something, and a nurse rushed to bring him water. He drank deeply, and then said another thing, a word none of them recognized. Mina. First, Jonathan didn't return. Then Lucy fell sick. Now, Mr. Swales. Mina swallowed hard. She didn't know the man well, but he had accompanied her on a few walks with Lucy, so she considered him a friend. It all happened the night of the storm. After the sea captain's funeral that morning, they were all walking back to town when someone screamed. He was covered before anyone saw him. They said it was the storm, but Mina didn't understand how a storm could break a man's neck. They buried him the following day. After the funeral, Mina took Lucy on a long walk along the cliffs to Robin Hood's Bay. She hoped the air and exercise would tire her out, so she'd stop walking at night. Lucy wasn't looking so anemic now, and at first, the night suggested that her plan had worked. Lucy was asleep, and at last, Mina was too. But then she wasn't. She awoke with an all-pervasive sense of dread. She didn't know how she knew, but she was sure something was wrong. Mina rushed to Lucy's room, threw open the door, and gasped. The curtains were fluttering in the open window, but the room was empty. Lucy was gone. Mina searched downstairs. Nothing. She put on her cloak and grabbed Lucy's. She was one sleeping woman. She couldn't have gotten far. But Mina was wrong about that. She finally saw Lucy's bedclothes fluttering in the wind on the far edge of the dilapidated abbey. As she ran closer, she saw that Lucy was not alone. There was a pitch-black form looming over her. Lucy lay flat, motionless, asleep on a stone seat. Immediately, Mina feared the worst and called out her friend's name. That was when Mina saw him, his face seared into her mind forever. It was bone white with red, gleaming eyes. His mouth was framed by a long, black mustache. Mina blinked, and Lucy was alone. It had been difficult to wake Lucy, but finally she pulled the woman to her feet and clasped a shawl around her neck. She was confused, but she went right back to sleep when they returned. Mina, however, did not. The next morning, Lucy woke Mina for the first time in days. She didn't know what it was, but she felt so much better, so much stronger. Mina rubbed the sleep from her eyes and looked at her friend, squinting. "Lucy, come closer. Bend down," she said. What was that? There, on Lucy's neck were 2 marks, like pinpricks, but with bits of blood dribbling out. Mina apologized. It was dark and they were in a hurry last night. She must have gotten Lucy a couple of times with the safety pin when she was putting on the shawl. It didn't look big enough to scar, and it should be healed by the wedding. Lucy smiled and laughed it off. Then Mina asked her a question. Last night, there was a man out by the Abbey. He had found Lucy sleeping. Was Lucy all right? Did anything happen? Lucy grimaced. No, of course not. Nothing had happened. But she didn't remember anything from last night, but she would know. She did know, though, that if Mina hadn't come to her rescue, something might have happened. She was truly thankful for such a good friend. Now let's go get some breakfast. Alive? Jonathan was alive? Mina had received a letter from Mr. Hawkins, Jonathan's boss, who received it from Sister Agatha at a hospital in Budapest. Jonathan was alive, but he was still in shock. He didn't remember anything of the trip after he left Bistrice, but Sister Agatha had shared something else. She wrote that he screamed in the night, of wolves and poison and blood, of ghosts and of demons. She said that this wasn't uncommon with brain fever, Jonathan's very 19th century diagnosis. Still, someone needed to come out. They didn't trust sending him back on his own. Mr. Hawkins said that it was only right for him to send Mina, and Mina jumped at the chance. He told her to take as long as they needed in Budapest. The firm would pay for it. Mina said goodbye to Lucy, promising she would be back in time for her wedding, and left for the other side of the world. I don't want to talk to you. You don't count now. The master is at hand, Renfield told Dr. Seward, not even looking into the man's eyes. That's what he'd said, not 5 hours prior, right before he escaped. Dr. Seward was roused from bed by 2 strong men. Renfield had managed to crush himself down enough to slip out the window. It was a 2-story drop, but luckily someone was walking by his door, so they heard the thud. By the time they made it into the room, he was limping across the field. He was heading north. Seward thought about it. What was north of here? Just the Carfax estate, one of the orderlies blurted. Seward nodded. Right, okay. He needed to throw on a coat. Then they'd go after Renfield. They didn't think he was a danger to people. Only tiny animals and maybe cats. Still, they needed to get him back. Nearly half an hour later, Dr. Seward and the orderlies crouched behind a crumbling stone pillar, listening. Renfield was pressed hard against the oak door of the old building, saying that he was here to do his bidding. Renfield was his slave. Renfield had been faithful, when the master was both near and far off. Now that he was here, he awaited the master's commands. Seward rolled his eyes. Gibberish. Mad gibberish. He nodded to the orderlies, who stood and left to go retrieve the patient. In the end, it took 3 burly men using all of their strength to subdue the madman. His strength was terrifying. And while he watched an orderly nearly break his arm pinning the waif-like patient to the ground, Dr. Seward began to wonder. Perhaps there was something to the life-eater hypothesis. But it didn't matter. They wrapped him up tighter than Dr. Seward had ever seen. And he had seen a lot of men in straitjackets. There would be no more sugar, flies, or sparrows for him. No more windows, either. He would be chained to a wall in a padded room. Renfield didn't respond like any other patient Seward had ever seen. He didn't threaten, scream, or cackle. He merely sat there calmly, looking at Seward as the door closed, mouthing the same phrase over and over. I shall be patient, master. It is coming. He was violent for a week after that, attacking anyone who entered his cell. Then, he grew calm. Over and over, for hours one morning, he repeated the phrase, now I can wait. Now I can wait. And after that, he was fine. He was kind, happy, even thoughtful. During the day, that is. At night, he became violent and angry, Dr. Seward tried to reason with him, but he claimed not to know anything about it. His behavior started to grow more and more predictable, and so they were able to loosen his bonds during the day and take him back to his normal room. He would only go back to the padded room at nightfall, and it was during one of these transfers that Renfield slipped past an orderly who left the door open for a bit too long. It was an odd, easily avoidable mistake. So much so that the madman didn't suspect that it might be intentional. Dr. Seward was waiting to follow. We'll catch up with Renfield and Dr. Seward on their unplanned field trip, but that will be right after this. Do you have hungry kids at home? You need RX bars. These bars have real, whole ingredients, like egg whites for protein, dates, nuts, unsweetened chocolate, and real fruit. And you can see for yourself. It's all listed right there on the front of the packaging. Adults can enjoy flavors like peanut butter, chocolate coconut, and mixed berry. But RX bars also makes a kid line with the same whole food ingredients, just in smaller, softer, more kid-friendly sizes. They sent us some, and we've been trying them for a couple of weeks. The first day went something like this.
What you eating?
RX bar.
Yeah? What's your favorite flavor RX bar?
Chocolate. I think I liked it. I love it.
So, yeah, winner. So much so that he unapologetically turned down fresh-baked cookies the next day. RX bars are not only the perfect after-school snack that you can actually feel good about giving your kid, but they'll satisfy a growing child's seemingly constant and unrelenting hunger. At least it does with our energetic 4-year-old. The kid line comes in 6 flavors. For adults, blueberry is my favorite. It's all gluten-free and dairy-free, with no artificial flavors or preservatives. RX bars offer you an exclusive pack of 6 adult bars and 4 kid bars, so the whole family can enjoy. For 25% off your first order, visit rxbar.com/fictional and enter promo code fictional at checkout. This week's episode is brought to you by HelloFresh. HelloFresh is a meal kit delivery service that shops, plans, and delivers step-by-step recipes and pre-measured ingredients so that you can just cook, eat, and enjoy. HelloFresh makes dinners so easy. They have 3 plans to choose from: classic, veggie, and family. And not only do they send all the ingredients to your door for super easy meals that take about 30 minutes to prepare, but they even have a 20-minute meal on the classic menu each week. Even takeout somewhere takes longer than 20 minutes. Instead, you have a meal that you made yourself that's delicious and likely better for you and less expensive than whatever you were going to get. We made 3 HelloFresh meals this week, and my favorite was the sweetest honey chicken with green beans over jasmine rice. It was super easy to make with no planning, no last-minute runs for ingredients, just pulling 1 bag from the fridge in about 30 minutes. For a total of $60 off, that's $20 off your first 3 boxes, visit hellofresh.com/fictional60 and enter code fictional60. It's like receiving 6 meals free when you go to hellofresh.com/fictional60 and enter code fictional60. That's fictional60. All right, now back to the show. Renfield ended up back at Carfax again. Dr. Seward waited, hunched behind the crumbling pillar. Something was going on here. Slowly, he peeked back around to look at the door, but Renfield had remembered. He remembered where Dr. Seward had waited the last time he had come to the master. So Seward found himself looking straight up at the madman, a massive rock above his head. Seward winced, and Renfield brought the rock down hard. Seward heard a thud and opened his eyes. Renfield was now on the ground, the rock laying harmlessly by his side. One of the orderlies had tackled him before he could murder Dr. Seward. It didn't take much to pin him down this time, just a look at the sky. Renfield glanced up to the moon and became calm. Seward's eyes followed his and saw nothing. Nothing but a big black bat flapping off into the night. It was late September. Timmy waited until the footsteps disappeared down the hall before sliding from his bed. His feet touched the floorboards, and he crept to the window. He looked out into the forest and smiled. There would be kisses for everyone. He heard about it while playing yesterday, and this was his 2nd time going. Each night after bed, they went to go see her. The Bloofer Lady, they called her. That wasn't her name, but they liked it. She was fun. She would let them play and dance until late in the night. And then the kisses. The first time it hurt, but then he felt called each night. Soon, it was all he could think about. He told more friends about the Bloofer lady, and more friends showed up each night. All got kisses. As Timmy crept back into his room later that night, he felt the marks on his neck. Soon, the Bloofer lady had said it with such a sweet smile. Soon, they would all be like her. Soon, they would be allowed to stay up and play all night long. Nearly a month and a half after setting sail, Mina docked on the east side of the island. She smiled and gripped the hand of her husband, Jonathan. She had never pictured herself getting married in a hospital in Budapest, her betrothed barely conscious but awake in a hospital bed. But that's what had happened, and she couldn't have been happier. Jonathan was growing happier and happier too. He didn't remember anything of what had happened in Transylvania, and he didn't want to. He knew his diary held the key, but he didn't read it. He didn't ever want to read it. He entrusted it to Mina, saying that she could read it if she liked, but unless his life depended on it, he never wanted to know. He had dreams, half remembered upon waking, and that was enough. She took the diary, wrapped it in paper, and sealed it in wax. She never needed to know what happened either. They were man and wife now. They would continue on, in love and in trust. They would only go forward, leaving the past in the past. Or so they thought. They had crossed the channel and landed in the south. There would be no going back to Whitby, not for them. Whitby was for holiday, and right now, there was work to be done. So much work. Mina was so happy. That night, as they walked back from dinner, she looked to her husband and smiled. But Jonathan was pale. His hands started to tremble, and Mina followed his eyes. She saw the face only for an instant, but that was all she needed. She had seen that face before, that night in the graveyard, with Lucy. It was a pale face, with a long black mustache. Their eyes met, the stranger's growing red in the night. He turned and seemed to disappear into his black cloak. The Count, Jonathan muttered, dropping to his knees. How could he be? He's here. Count Dracula's here, was all he managed before passing out. It took 2 men to carry him back to their home. When he was safely in bed, Mina slumped down in a chair. Dracula. Count Dracula. Mina only knew the name from a few times Jonathan had said it before he left for Transylvania. But Mina knew Dracula had been the nobleman with whom he had met, right before he lost all memory of the incident. She dug through her case and found the journal he had kept on his trip. She had sealed it because she thought it was in the past. Clearly, however, it wasn't. He was now in England, and, if Mina could believe her eyes, it was the same man she had seen in the graveyard with Lucy. She would open it. She would talk to Jonathan and open it in the morning. Whatever it contained, it was the key to helping them all. In the meantime, Mina picked up her letters. She had many. A few from Lucy, one from Hawkins, one from Dr. Seward. Wasn't that the doctor Lucy had turned down? Why was he writing? And there was a final one from some doctor named Abraham Van Helsing. She opened the telegraph, but the letter opener fell from her hand and clanged to the floor. Lucy had taken a turn for the worse after Mina left. They tried everything they could, but she slipped away from them. Lucy was dead. After Mina left, Lucy's bad days started to outnumber her good. She was sleeping later and later, and becoming weaker and weaker. She had all the symptoms of acute anemia. But her fiancé, Arthur, had no idea how to help. Then he realized there was one man who might know. One man who cared about Lucy almost as much as he did. Dr. Seward, from the lunatic asylum down by London. One of the other men whose proposal she had turned down for his own. Swallowing his pride, he called for Dr. Seward down at the hospital. Dr. Seward, for all of his talent, couldn't figure it out. According to all of his tests, she was fine. She wasn't even technically anemic. He apologized to Lucy and Arthur, but said he might know of someone who could help. Seward sent a letter to the continent, and a day later, he received a reply. By the end of the week, Abraham Van Helsing was in England. He was Seward's former teacher, and a man of too many terminal degrees to count. Seriously, the book says he had an MD, PhD, Doctor of Letters, and then it just has 3 etceteras. But later context clues seem to indicate he was an attorney as well, among other things. He was first and foremost a Dutch doctor with a completely open mind. And when he inspected Lucy's neck, he knew exactly what was going on. But, oddly enough, he didn't tell Seward or Arthur. All he told them was that she needed blood. And blood was what she got. Over several nights, the 3 men gave her blood transfusions, and for a time she started to get better. After the not at all subtle Victorian analogy of human bodily fluid transfers that left a woman flushed and happy and the men spent, it looked like Lucy was going to be okay. They used this opportunity to get her back home, to London. Lucy had been traveling with her sick mother and Mina, but Mina had been out of the country. For reasons Seward and Arthur didn't quite understand, Van Helsing instructed the room be packed with garlic flowers and the window be shut. He explained it to the men that didn't live there, but neglected to inform Lucy's sick mother, who did live there. The next morning, they discovered she had cleared all the horrid-smelling stuff out of her daughter's room moments after they left and opened the window. Lucy was now at death's door. It was only by substantial transfusions from Van Helsing that Lucy survived the day. She was weak, but over the next 4 days, she grew better and better. Van Helsing scolded the mother, telling her to never remove anything from the room again. She was lucky, because it looked like everything was going to be all right. Then came the wolf. Seward and Arthur were exhausted. Van Helsing had returned to Amsterdam for some of his books, and Lucy was worn out, so no one was reading the local paper. No one would have seen that a wolf escaped from the zoo, and then returned the next day, covered in glass. No one would have made the connection between the wolf and a broken window at the home of Lucy Westenra. Lucy's mother had been worried about her daughter that night, so she huddled close to her daughter in bed. Even with the garlic necklace, it just felt better to be together. Unfortunately, it would prove to be both of their undoings. The wolf, named Berserker by the zookeeper, plowed straight through Lucy's window, the shattered glass lodging in his skin beneath his fur. The mother screamed, but Lucy, under a strong opiate, was slow to wake. The mother shook and shook her daughter, pulling at her, ripping the garlic from around her neck. She looked at it, remembering something about it being for medicinal purposes, and she started to put it back. When she felt it, her heart was weak, too weak, and the terror of a full-grown, snarling wolf crashing through her window was enough. She called out to her maids, who lived there and were not mentioned up until this point, and she collapsed. The wolf ducked from the window as the maids opened the door, saw their lady sprawled out on the floor, eyes wide and chest not moving. She was dead. Instead of doing anything with the body, investigating the glass, or making sure Lucy was okay, the 4 maids all decided that, yeah, they needed a drink first. So they went to the dining room, but didn't notice an open window near the bottles of wine. A drugged sip of wine for each of them, and they collapsed in the kitchen. Back in her room, Lucy gripped her own diary. She was coming out of a twilight sleep as she looked out into the darkness, and the man from her nightmares stepped into the room. She didn't last long after that night. Even with the return of Quincy Morris, the rich Texan that had proposed to her, giving her blood, she continued to decline. It was on the morning of September 20th, 8 days before her wedding was to take place, that the wounds on her neck disappeared. Seward, Quincy Morris, and Van Helsing woke Arthur Holmwood, the man that had won Lucy's heart, and told him that the time was near. The 3 looked at Lucy. After everything she had been through, she seemed to be recovering the beauty and death that she had lost during her long illness. Her last words were turning to her fiancé, her husband that would never be, and, with a sultry voice, asking him for a kiss. He leaned in, but Van Helsing gripped his shoulder. Not on your life, not for your living soul or hers. He stood between Lucy and Arthur. She was there, begging him for a kiss, but Van Helsing was unyielding. Arthur could kiss her goodbye on the forehead, and then only once. Oddly enough, she gave Van Helsing a look that seemed grateful that he wouldn't let her kiss him. Poor girl, Seward said after Lucy had breathed her last. There is peace for her at last. It is the end. No, Van Helsing said, without looking away from the body. It is only the beginning. Mina sat back, stunned. Lucy was dead. Her best friend. She cried, remembering how Lucy was recovering when Mina had left. She was getting better. But now she was gone. The funeral was already over, too. Mina had never gotten to say goodbye to her dearest friend. She was so distraught that it wasn't until the next morning when she read another letter from the pile. It was informing them of another death and another funeral. Mr. Hawkins, Jonathan's elderly boss, was dead. And Jonathan and Mina were rich. Hawkins never had children, and he had been watching over Jonathan since the man was in school. Jonathan was a solicitor now, and the only person he saw fit to carry on his business after he was gone. His estate was massive and his business thriving. Once Jonathan recovered from losing a true friend and mentor, he wouldn't have to set out on his own. He could take over the business. After the funeral, Mina and Jonathan returned to their humble house. They were rich now, but Jonathan never wanted it like this. He had loved Hawkins. Mina told him that she did too, but it would pass. It would pass and they would be happy again. It had been Hawkins's time, and he had left the closest thing he had to his son everything he could ever need. Jonathan needed to lie down. He was still recovering from his brain fever, but would need to go in next week to go over Mr. Hawkins' papers. Clients were clients, after all, and they were now his clients. As he slept, Mina read the paper. She read about a strange woman near Hampstead Heath, where Lucy was buried. A few parents had caught the children's bedrooms empty and discovered that some woman they called the Bloofer Lady was coming for them in the night. She set the article aside and picked up her husband's journal. She hadn't talked to him about it. She wasn't sure she should look inside. He was still dealing with the effects of what happened out east. She could do this for him. Mina cracked the wax seal and opened Jonathan's diary. Dr. Abraham Van Helsing sat across the table from Mina. He told her it had been a long month, going back and forth between Amsterdam and England, and he was getting old. So he cut right to it. He had read her and Lucy's correspondences. All of them. He apologized, but he was her doctor, and he had to know everything that had happened to her. Mina paused. What exactly did happen to her? Lucy was a young woman in the prime of her life, and in less than 2 months she went from thriving to dead. Van Helsing answered her question with a question. Had she read her husband's journal yet? She was about to ask, but then she remembered. Her letters to Lucy explaining the brain fever and the Count. Mina nodded. Yes, it was horrifying. Van Helsing sat back. Then she already knew what killed Lucy, or at least that was his hypothesis. If she would permit him, he would like to read the diary. Mina nodded and handed over the papers she had made. She had been practicing her typing. It was more important now than ever, since they now owned a successful law firm. Van Helsing took the papers with a smile. He imagined these would be invaluable in their fight. Fight? Mina asked. Van Helsing hoped he was wrong. That Lucy had died of some new illness. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't the case. He would be back for lunch tomorrow to talk about the journal. But Abraham Van Helsing wasn't back for lunch. He was back for breakfast. It was a difficult breakfast for Jonathan. It was full of things that he had hidden away within himself, hoping to never have to see again. but he was surprised that Van Helsing not only sympathized, but believed him. Jonathan said that Dracula was in England, but he was young. He remembered arriving at the castle and seeing this old man with a white mustache. In London the other day, he saw a younger man with a black beard. How did the Count change his appearance? Van Helsing said that Jonathan knew the answer to that question. Or, at least, he had known. He slid the copy of Jonathan's journal across the table to him. It was time to go back. He knew it would be painful, but he needed to look inside himself, to that place where he dared not to look. Jonathan took the papers, stood, and began reading. He knew the answers would be there, but in that place where he dared not look, there would also be the Count, staring back at him, waiting. A few days later, Doctors Van Helsing and Seward arrived at Hampstead Heath. Seward hadn't been back since they buried Lucy. Van Helsing had wanted to cut off her head and take out her heart. But the men who loved her, Seward, Arthur, and Quincy, had refused to allow him to mutilate the body. She was already dead. It was over. Except it wasn't. Van Helsing had stayed in England after Lucy's death, and he had read the papers. At first, she sounded like a boogeyman to scare children into staying in their houses at night. But Van Helsing, he went to the hospital. He investigated it. He had seen the bites on the children's necks, and already they were getting weaker. Tonight would only confirm something he already knew to be true, and prove to Seward. He had gone to Seward with this hypothesis, and the man nearly slammed the door in his face. Now, here they were, at the tomb of Lucy Westenra. Lucy had never been rich in life, but her husband-to-be was now Lord Godalming. Long story, Arthur's father had died, but anyway, Holmwood, now Lord Godalming, had loved her, and so Lucy had a tomb in Hampstead Heath. Seward and Van Helsing had dinner, and then headed out. At first the streets were packed. Then there were a few horses and carriages, then only carriages sped past in the night. Eventually, they were all alone at Hampstead Heath. The men jumped from their carriage and lit a couple lanterns. They entered and stood over the body. And then Van Helsing got to work, pulling out a concealed crowbar. Seward demanded to know what he was doing, but Van Helsing kept working. He kept prying. Seward stepped back and clenched his jaw. He couldn't see her, he said, pacing back and forth. He couldn't see her like this. But Van Helsing said he must. He had to look. He had to see for himself. Finally, the lid was free, and Seward raised his handkerchief to his nose. He had smelled dead bodies before. Wait. Seward lowered his handkerchief and stepped forward, his eyes opening wide. It was impossible. Van Helsing nodded. So it was true. The one they called the Bloofer Lady was Lucy. Seward stared down at the empty coffin, the back of his neck growing prickly. It went against everything he, a doctor, knew to be true. Lucy had come back, and she was a monster. That's it for this week. Next week, we're going to be finishing the story of Dracula. One of the things I find really cool about this story is the interplay between the ancient and the modern. Dracula is this evil force that's nearly 1,000 years old, and it's precisely because 19th century England is so modern that it's such a good target. The people of Transylvania know the old ways, and, as we'll see next week, they still fall victim to the Count, but they mostly manage to keep themselves safe. When Jonathan met the Count, he was some weakened old man, holed up in his castle, the surrounding countryside knowing exactly what he was. Those same old ways that kept the people of Transylvania safe are seen as ridiculous superstition to people like Seward. And it's only because of Van Helsing's extremely open mind, and probably inordinate trust in folklore, that the threat is even discovered. Like the stories of Frankenstein, Second Variety, and Dracula, we have to be watchful for when technology ceases to become a positive, and instead starts to become a weakness. Or, worse yet, a threat. Thanks so much for listening this time. If you'd like to leave a review, Apple Podcasts is the best place, and you can find the show there at apple.fictional.fm. Today's episode was adapted from Dracula by Bram Stoker, and now I'm going to throw it over to our guest host to finish up the episode.
That's all for this week. This episode was with my daddy, Jason Weiser. And produced by my mom, Carissa Weiser. Thanks much for listening, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.